This is Karen with NewClevelandRadio.net, and it is time for Lessons Learned. And we will be talking today about women's issues. And I have Leslie Howard with me today. And Leslie resides on the West Coast. Um, and I say that for a special reason because I have learned that people on the West Coast seem to be a little bit more caring of themselves. Um, Here in
Oh,
the Midwest, we run in circles and we nurture everybody around us. And when we get an ache or a pain, we just ignore it. And sometimes we wait too long. So I like the fact that many of my West Coast friends and relatives have learned how to really live life. So, Leslie, tell our viewers a little bit about yourself.
well, that's such an interesting introduction because I'm from New York, and I would say that that's true. That when I lived on the East Coast, life was so fast paced. I never had time for anything. I think that's where my pelvic floor problems started brewing. And yeah, living in California is definitely a little bit slower pace. So that's interesting. So as you come further west, perhaps the self-care thing takes hold. But well, thank you for having me. And longtime yoga practitioner and teacher. I study primarily in the Iyengar world. And about 10 years ago, I was diagnosed with hypertonic pelvic floor. And so that set me off on a whole journey and has now become what I mainly am known for teaching is pelvic floor health using yoga and breath work.
Well, and the interesting part is that within the last year or two, people are talking about pelvic floor issues. Prior to that, um, if they were talking about it, it was really in secret. Um, Women weren't sharing it with each other. I found out 2 years ago that I have pelvic floor prolapse, and it is putting a lot of pressure on all my internal organs. Um, And for almost 20 years, I've been complaining about a pain on my right side, right where the appendix are. But we know I haven't been having appendicitis for 20 years. Um, and it took up until about a month ago for a doctor to say to me, "Didn't anybody tell you this is from the pelvic floor?" And I said, "No." And she said, "How often do you get it?" And I said, two, 3 times a month. And it can be devastating. And so she had me keep a journal to see when it was happening, and it was happening when I was overly stressed and overly working. So it's a real thing. Yet for 20 years, I had doctors say to me,
It's a real thing.
"No, it's nothing. It went away. It didn't come back for a while. You're all right." And it's not life threatening, as you and I both know, but it surely can take over our life to the point that
Absolutely.
it's
Absolutely. I'm
not good.
sorry that that happened to you. And unfortunately, it's a very common story. And a lot of people end up in my workshops that like they didn't even know they didn't know what they didn't know, you know. They find out, wow, oh, like just what you said, oh, this pain in my back or this sacroiliac pain is from my pelvic floor. Wait, what? And unfortunately, the medical community, they're catching up, but as crazy as it seems, a gynecologist might not be able to tell you that it's a pelvic floor issue, that can still be true. So really it's the physical therapist, occupational therapist world that is really making a lot of headway in this department. And now slowly the medical schools are changing where if you're going for gynecology, you have to do a residency with the pelvic floor PT. So it is changing. But yeah, you and I are from the era of, you know, gynecologists often says, oh, you know, don't worry about it. It's fine. It's going to be, you know, it's implying that perhaps it's psychosomatic.
Right?
Yeah, so I definitely can relate to your story quite a bit. So yeah.
So tell me a little bit about how you have adapted yoga and, because for anybody listening, the physical therapy, it is invasive and you have to go into the physical therapy with an open mind. I come from a generation where when I started the physical therapy the first time, um, I sat on one side of the room and I let the therapist sit on the other side of the room, and we really got nothing accomplished. But what we did accomplish was my getting myself to feel comfortable with what the physical therapy was going to be all about. My problem was when I came home and was supposed to, take care of myself in between sessions. Um, I wasn't, because again, I felt like, this is sexual. It's not physical therapy.
I run into this a lot because in my workshops, I encourage people to take matters into their own hands, quite
Right.
literally. And I describe at the end of my workshops how to do an internal pelvic floor massage because it's not as commonly known that many of us carry too much tension in our pelvic floors. I think that what's out there in the media is if you're female and getting older, well, my God, you better be doing your Kegels and tighten things up and et cetera, et cetera. And I have found now working in the yoga world for 10 years, I find way more people are too tight than too loose.
Right.
Now that may be because I'm in the yoga world, so it's more fitness oriented, and so maybe people who are caring more about their fitness have tighter pelvic floors. I don't know, but I'm just saying that the numbers are large that go towards hypertonicity, too much tightness. So interesting choice of words you use that you found the pelvic floor PT invasive. Yeah, so I think actually maybe trying to do this on your own might actually be more helpful before you go to the PT. And I, of course, run up against women telling me that they're not comfortable touching themselves that way. And so then I say, meet yourself where you are. So if it's just putting your hand on your belly, maybe it's putting your hand on your vulva, but over clothes. Whatever it takes for you to start a better relationship with this part of your body. It is your body. And unfortunately, in some ways, our agency over this part of our body has been taken from us. So it's really a journey. I start all my workshops by saying every pelvis has a story, and you need to know your own story to be able to heal yourself.
Absolutely.
So let's see, you asked me about how I use yoga to help heal. Well, the first thing I start with is the breath, which is foundational to any yoga practice. But I have also found, no studies on this that I'm aware of, but I have found people that are hypertonic, too tight, 90% of the time they have a reverse breathing pattern. Which is they're pulling their abdomen in and up on the inhalation rather than thinking of an inhale as receiving. So your pelvic floor responds to your breath, to your respiratory diaphragm. And so in healthy, good breathing, the respiratory diaphragm goes down. And then your pelvic floor should actually slightly move down and widen and stretch on the inhale. Not anything that you might even be able to feel if you're a more subtle practitioner, absolutely. But just to even know that is helpful. A lot of people, women and men, when you tell them to take a deep breath in, they suck their abdomen in and up. And that is then teaching the pelvic floor to tighten when it should be actually stretching. So I always start with the breath, getting people to be more in touch with their breath. Also, a lot of people with pelvic floor problems, whether they're too loose or too tight, are shallow breathers. So they're breathing more in their chest. And really, the best thing you can do for your pelvic floor, whether you're too tight or too loose, is to breathe better, because if you're too loose, your pelvic floor is going to get more tone from the exhalation. And if you're too tight, you're going to get more stretching with a good inhalation. So that's the foundation. I will go into pranayama sometimes, but honestly, I find so many people aren't even just regular breathing okay, that we can spend sessions on the breath. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I talk to people about is what are they doing all day? Are you sitting all day? Are you standing all day? What's your job? So, there's jobs where you're standing, you're a hairstylist, baker. There's jobs where you're behind a computer. And then we look at people's posture, because breathing is something that you're doing all day, all night, hopefully. Posturing is something that you're doing, in your waking hours. How are you holding your body? That is something you have control over. And a lot of us have what I call slump asana, which is a very rounded back, which does not help your pelvic floor to be strong. So that would be number two. And then number three is asana, yoga postures. And so in my general workshop, I try to get across the idea that women can be, well, people, not just women, people can be too tight in their pelvic floor, they can be too loose in their pelvic floor, and very commonly they can be a combination. Often one side is tight, one side is loose, or the front is more loose and the back is more tight. So you actually have to figure out, you could do this with the help of an internal physical therapist, but you can also figure out a lot on your own. People in my workshops go, oh my God, I never noticed my right side doesn't respond as well as my left side, for example. So once you figure out where you are on the spectrum of too tight, too loose combination, that's when you apply your yoga postures. So let's say your pelvic floor is tight on both sides. Then I would encourage that person to do more forward bending poses, hip opener poses, restorative poses. If you're too loose in the pelvic floor, I would apply more of the lateral standing poses, particularly the ones external rotation of the thighs is going to help contract the pelvic floor. And then also back bends, because you're tucking your pelvis in back bends. So when you tuck your pelvis, you're bringing the pelvic floor into more of a contraction. And then the beauty of yoga is, let's say you're one of those cases where one side is tight and one side is loose. You can work with your asymmetrical poses. Not that you would do an asymmetrical pose just on one side, but let's say, for example, the right side of your pelvic floor is too tight and the left side of your pelvic floor is too loose. Well, poses like lunges or Hanumanasana, the splits pose, like right leg forward to stretch the forward hamstring, but stretch the back hip flexor. You can really apply yoga so succinctly and so individually to what's going on with your pelvic floor. So it's a perfect practice to help heal your pelvic floor.
A lot of things that you've been talking about, when I was first diagnosed with this, um, I now realize I was diagnosed with this back in the early 80s, um, actually late 70s.
Mhm.
I had a gynecologist who told me that I was way too tight. And what he wanted to do, and I did not let him do, he was going to give me some sort of injections to kill the nerves in the pelvic area.
Mhm.
And I had never been pregnant. My husband at the time, we were trying. Intercourse was always difficult for me,
Yeah.
but I always remembered something my mother always would say to me, good girls will always be tight.
Wow.
So I expected it always to hurt and
Wow.
be tight. Um, and my current husband, we've been together 37 years. He is just the most gentle person in the whole world. And so if I twinged or said it hurt or there was burning, we would just stop. And I've realized that there's something wrong. Okay. It shouldn't hurt all the time.
Right.
So I went to another gynecologist, and the gynecologist said to me, well, some women just have to grin and bear it.
Yeah,
That
I'm shocked, and yet I'm not, because I've heard this story, some variation of these
and
stories.
girlfriends
Yeah,
didn't really sit around and have conversations like this.
right,
And I'm so glad that women are doing it today
right,
because it makes us understand, number 1, I'm not alone. I'm
right,
not crazy.
right,
There is treatment. Uh, Sadly, the insurance companies don't want to pay for a lot of the treatments.
right.
But if there are other things that are non-invasive, such as yoga, that can at least give us some relief,
Yeah,
we need to talk about it.
right. Yeah, so yeah, as I was saying, like that might be a good beginning, to just realizing, like you said, there's nothing wrong with you. That your pelvis, for whatever reason, again, this goes back to every pelvis has a story. I mean, the messaging you were getting from early on. I had a woman who went through my training, went with her daughter, her 16-year-old daughter, to her first gynecologist appointment. And the gynecologist kept asking the girl, are you having any problems? And finally, at the end, the girl said, well, I'm having some incontinence, but everybody my age is 16. And the gynecologist said, oh, well, young lady, it's time for you to learn about Kegels. And my student, thankfully, like, had been schooled on this whole thing.
Right.
And she said, no, 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 no. It turns out her daughter was a ballet dancer. Okay. And the ballet teacher constantly telling you, lift the pelvic floor, pull in and up on the pelvic floor. So tight, these poor young women, they're having incontinence. Now, that might be like, what? You're too tight and you have incontinence. But again, this is where, like, the information out there is incomplete. So you can have incontinence from too much tone in your pelvic floor. You are the perfect example of someone has too much tone in their pelvic floor and has a prolapse. So again, you think prolapse, for those of you out there that don't know what a prolapse is, that means one of the pelvic organs is falling from its natural place. Okay. So more commonly it's thought, oh, maybe you had too many babies, or maybe you have too much weight, or whatever. And so many times people come to me, I have a pelvic organ prolapse, I've never been pregnant. They're too tight, because usually people that have that situation have dealt with constipation for a large part of their life. They're straining every day to go to the bathroom. They're putting a lot of pressure on the ligaments of the pelvic organs, and they don't know that they're too tight. So it's just so pervasive and so maddening to me that your experience is the experience of this young woman being told to do Kegels. She's a virgin. She's having incontinence, and the gynecologist, if her mother hadn't been there and her mother hadn't gone to my training,
Sure.
would have been like, okay, honey, you're going to be doing your Kegels, which would make things way worse.
And it's interesting because right before I did my physical therapy the last time, um, my gynecologist at the time basically said to me that I should be doing Kegels, and I was overdoing them.
Right.
Every time I'd be sitting here, doing a
Yeah.
show, and I
Right.
was doing them. I'd
Right.
be putting on my makeup, I was doing them. And um, it wasn't until I went to physical therapy and she asked me, I think she told me to clench my back end. And I thought I was, but I wasn't. Okay. I said, well, of course I'm doing it. She said, no, you're not. She said, you're doing a Kegel. She said, your body automatically is doing this. How long have you been doing this? And I said, most of my adult life. And she said, well, you need to stop.
Yeah.
And that was difficult in the beginning because it became a routine for
Of
me.
course,
Yeah,
we don't even realize what our holding patterns are because they're so ingrained and we've been doing them so long. So,
absolutely.
yeah.
So when you talk about breathing, I'm a shallow breather. In
Mhm.
fact, last week I had my yearly cardiology workup, and my only complaint is I feel out of breath.
Mhm.
And he said, it's the way you're breathing. And, I looked at him, was like, seriously, doc? And he goes, you tell me. And then I thought about it. I can exercise, I can walk, I can do all these things, but I always feel short of breath. It doesn't stop me from doing things. But
Well, given what you've told me, you probably have that reverse breath pattern.
yes,
Yeah. So, yeah, very hard. Again, you've had it for decades, right?
right.
And so very hard to even, you're like, you're not even aware of it at first. And then to catch yourself over and over and then to change it. I mean, it is a journey. But again, this is where yoga is so helpful. I mean, I really try to start my students off, my pelvic students, pelvic floor students, with either face up breath with weight on them, face down breath, side lying breath, whatever gives them the ability to feel that their breath actually starts in the pelvic floor. So if you can think of how when you fill a glass of water, you're filling it from the bottom to the top. It's the same with the breath. Even though, yes, you're inhaling through your nose, the first place that your breath should start to touch is the pelvic floor. And so that the breath is filling, your inhalation is filling from the bottom to the top. And if there's pelvic floor issues, a lot of people are just breathing in their upper body, and it's very inefficient. Very inefficient. So the breath, your body has to work so much harder to get oxygen. So that's what's going on with you, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly the way they described it. And it was like, but I've been doing this my whole life. And then the question was, do you want to change? And I said, yes. They said, well, it's not going to happen overnight, but you're going to learn. Um, and we did another show last week with two women who are both going through some form of pelvic floor issue. Both of them, they're both friends. It's strange that how they found each other. And their issues are totally different, and their issues are different than mine. Although we're finding that most of the procedures that are being recommended are exactly the same, but they'll be done a little differently.
Yeah.
And so this one woman said, but I've never had kids, but my pelvic floor is so tight that she said she would go to urinate and she'd sit there for 10, 15 minutes to get it all out.
To relax.
And the other one has had 3 children, and each of them were vaginal births, but with forceps.
Mm-hmm.
And she said prior to having her first child, she could never even use a Tampax.
Right.
So here we're having this conversation, and the 3 of us felt vindicated at the end of the podcast because we could say, look at, we are strangers. We didn't plan this.
Right.
It happened.
Yeah.
So when you're teaching yoga breathing, you don't expect somebody to walk out of the classroom the first day and be
Cured.
the best of it, right?
Well, no, I don't expect that, but I have had an occasional student. I won't even say an occasional. I've had many students who come in with, let's say, a pain level of 8. My goal is to get it down, no matter,
Right.
significantly. So that happens very frequently. I had one young man who worked for Google who had severe backside pelvic pain, so around his anal sphincter. And same thing. I said, let's look at your breath. Let's look at your posture. What are you doing all day? You're sitting behind a computer. His posture was horrible, like super slumped. So I said, well, has anyone ever talked to you about the way you sit? No. What's wrong with the way I sit? And then I describe why that's so important. So we get him to sit up properly. And he's like, oh my God, I don't have any pain. I mean, he could not believe it. Just from adjusting the way he was sitting, he's like, oh my God, I don't have pain. And like, he just kept like not being able to believe that was that. Now that was an unusual experience that I was able to get rid of his pain like on the spot. But he wrote me later, he's like, I rode home in my car, sitting up on my sitting bones with my tail behind me, and I had no pain. He's like, I can't believe it. So occasionally it happens. But my goal in teaching this work is really to give people tools. Not all poses help all people. I'll say, generally like a favorite of my tight pelvic floor group is the pose Prasarita Padottanasana, which is the wide-legged forward bend, because that's accessible for most people. Most people can do it propped up, up with their hands on a chair or their head supported on a chair seat. That's a favorite, I would say, of most of my students with hypertonicity. But once in a blue moon, I get someone who says, I found that pose aggravating. And those are people that sometimes this happens, where if a muscle is used to being really tight for a long time and then you stretch it, sometimes it freaks out. It's like, I use I'm a cat person, okay? So I use the analogy of a feral cat. If you've ever tried to be kind to a feral cat, you have to be so gentle and so like, don't move too fast. You have to be patient beyond patience to get a feral cat to trust you. Sometimes it's like that with the pelvic floor. It's like you have to be so kind and so gentle and so patient, because if you go too fast for, again, the individual, sometimes what will happen is, it tightens back. It's a protection. A lot of us have this armoring for, again, a multitude of reasons. And the armoring, we need to let go of it, but until we feel safe, we're not going to let go of it. So if I'm stretching the pelvic floor too soon on a student and they say, actually my pain level is going up a little bit. Okay, too much too soon. We go back to a little bit less opening pose.
So one of the things that they had me use at home when I was going to physical therapy were the dilators.
Yeah.
And in the beginning, it was not easy to insert them, but it got better, but I can't move them because when I move them, I'm in pain. And again, I thought there must be something wrong with me. Why can't I actually get this in? But if I move it right, left, up, down, I see stars. So when I found this new doctor, before she even examined me, luckily, what I loved about the appointment with her, I met with her, I was fully clothed. We had this conversation. She told me how she was going to examine me, what she was going to look for.
Mm-hmm.
And if I wasn't prepared that day, she was going to send me home and I could come back when I was. But I was prepared. But I wasn't prepared for how painful it was because it's a year and a half since I went through physical therapy. During the year and a half, I had knee surgery. So that has changed a lot of things for me. And so now I'm going back and saying, hey, I need to get this other issue back on track and taken care of. And the way she explained it to me as she was examining me was that the therapy that I went through, I was able to loosen a very small part of my pelvic floor.
Mm-hmm.
But because I didn't stay at it over the last year and a half, she said, that's why when you put the dilator in and you try to move it, you're going to see stars. And so it's going to take time. And, obviously she's not going to give me a timetable. She told me to keep up with my normal exercising, which is cardiovascular. I'm either walking or riding a stationary bike. And I ride a recumbent bike because when she heard me riding a bike, she was really concerned that I was.
The recumbent, I find, then tucks your pelvis more. So it's not, I don't agree with that.
Really?
Yeah, because on the recumbent, most people cannot sit on their sitting bones. They're sitting on their tailbone, which is shortening the pelvic floor. So
I have to pay attention to that tonight.
yeah, I would look at that. The other thing I would say about what you just told me is you will not get better unless you do this to yourself. And my PT in the beginning wanted me to do this twice a day. And I'm like, there's just no way I'm going to do that. Like, I just don't have the time or bandwidth for that. And she's like, well, I'm telling you twice a day, so you'll do it once a day. And I'm going to tell you 20 minutes so that you'll do 10. And I was really committed. I'd had it. Like, sitting was painful. I couldn't have sex with my husband. It was just all a drag. And I was just like, I am going to fix this. So I just committed to doing it every single night before I went to bed. 10 minutes, I would do it. So just starting with the dilator in there, I would just, deep breathing, reverse Kegels, where you're just slightly pushing down, just super slight. Moving it just incrementally. Can you still take a deep breath? Those are the things that are going to help you. And with your prolapse, what I would suggest you do, because you're a yoga person, is if you can elevate your pelvis, that would be super helpful. So that the organ is going to slip up rather than making it slip down.
Got it.
Yeah.
So can you show us at least one pose today that?
Well, I'll show you. Okay, so I'm going to show you, actually, I'll show you a couple of poses. So I'll show you first the pose that I mentioned, the Prasarita Padottanasana, which if you don't speak Sanskrit, you might not know what that means. But it's the wide-legged forward bend. I'll show it to you sideways.
Okay.
So I take my feet about maybe 3.5 feet apart. And so the way this pose is traditionally taught is you walk your hands back, but I don't teach it that way. There's nothing wrong with this, but it's rounding my back and tucking my tail.
Okay.
If you have hypertonicity, you already have too much of that. So to get your pelvic floor to stretch in this pose, I keep people a little bit up in the pose so that they can lift the sitting bones and lift the tailbone. So you want to feel like you've got a peacock feather tail.
Okay.
Okay, so that and doing it in a supported way, you can stay for a while. People who are super flexible, interestingly enough, have a higher rate of tightness in their pelvic floor. So what I notice when I'm teaching them is they just want to flop down. They just want to go into their flexibility. So I would back someone like that up even more and have them up on a chair so that they can stay up enough that they can get their pelvic floor to open. Okay. So that's a really good pose. The other pose that I love that's really good for pelvic floors too tight, too loose is a pose that I call the goddess. And so that's where you're kind of in a horse riding pose, but I'm going to show you from the side. It's really important that you go into this with your pelvis untucking to get the stretch. So what people that have tight pelvic floors tend to do is they go down and they want to tuck under. So it's really important that you go down with your butt out. And what I tell people is, hey, who isn't at the kitchen sink 3 times a day? Is, you're usually, putting your coffee cup in there or washing your utensils or whatever. Hold on to the kitchen sink and go down and just hang out there for a couple of moments. So helpful. And you can do it a couple times a day, and that can really make a big difference. If you know that you are not too tight and you actually need a little bit of tone, same pose, same way, except you're really working the legs differently. So when you're too tight, you're allowing your pelvis to sink down and stretch. When you're too loose, what you want to do is squeeze the heels together like you're trying to gather the mat up into your pelvic floor. And you'll feel when you pull the heels in that your inner thighs get activated and your inner thigh muscles are connected to the second layer of the pelvic floor. So that you're sitting, even though I'm not tucking my pelvis, my sitting bones are actually moving towards each other and I'm activating the pelvic floor. So working the legs strongly, like I said earlier, if you're too loose in the pelvic floor, the lateral standing poses like warrior 2, side angle, triangle, those poses can be so helpful for strengthening the pelvic floor. And I would say if you're too tight, don't be afraid of those poses. You just want to weight your practice a little bit more to the stretching of the pelvic floor poses. Because I also find that some people have too much tone in their pelvic floor because they lack stability. So if you lack stability, your pelvic floor is going to, again, react in a protective mode. So again, it goes into that feral cat, like, I'm afraid, I need to brace. So, so I definitely encourage people that are too tight to do stability stuff, but to be careful with it, to not overdo that, because you need to go towards stretching and releasing. Yeah, so.
Well, we've learned a lot today. I will tell you.
Well, I only hope that it's helpful and that more people learn faster than you and I did about that there's help out there. There's pelvic floor PTs, there's yoga, there's breath work. Yeah, so there's much you can do about it now.
Well, and it's interesting because the last 15 years of my mother's life, I now realize that she had pelvic floor issues. Um, she had incontinence. And of course, the doctor said, well, you're in your 80s. What do you expect? And she said, but last week I was okay. And now all of a sudden I'm not. And I don't think it was quite that way, but to some degree. And the last 15 years of her life, she really didn't want to go to many places
Yeah,
because of the incontinence.
right.
And toward the end of her life, I had shared with her what I was going through. And she just looked at me and she said, oh my God, did I pass this down to you? And I said, whether you did or not, it's okay. I'll get through it. I was just sorry that she never had the opportunity to get through it. And
Yeah.
again,
Yeah.
to all our listeners,
And you bring up a really beautiful thing that I find over and over again is, yeah, if you think about, you came through your mother's pelvis, and did she pass it on to you? Maybe, because we pass on the way we carry our body, the way we walk. She gave you verbal messaging about good girls.
right?
But I worked with one student who really presented so much like she had been a victim of sexual abuse. I asked her in the intake form, I asked her during the session because it felt okay to ask her, and she was like, no, no, no. She came back the next session and she told me, I talked to my mother, and it turned out her mother had been a victim of sexual abuse. And
Wow.
she hadn't, but she had taken on some of that tension. It's very interesting. So yeah, that's a great story to illuminate that.
Well, we're going to want to have you back on again.
All right.
And
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting, some of the women who have been on the show, who've experienced pelvic floor, um, we should possibly do a panel so that they can understand. Because it seems like we're all getting treatment a little differently. We're all getting different messages.
Uh-huh.
Um, and that's okay as long as it works for us.
Exactly.
But I want people to know, if it's not working, you gotta
Try something
you
else.
gotta move on. And um, I wanted to go back to my original physical therapist, and it was my doctor who made the suggestion. As great as she is, she's like number one in the city here, because I didn't get the relief I needed.
Right.
That maybe now I should see somebody else.
Yeah.
And they said, you can always go back to her if
Yeah.
but let's try something else.
I could not agree more, and I tell my students the same thing. Don't give up on physical therapy because you didn't get help through somebody. Just like any profession, there's different, you connect differently with different people. People have different techniques. Try a different pelvic floor PT if you're not getting the care that you want or the result you want.
So if our listeners want to reach out to you for more information, how can they do that?
My website is my name plus yoga. So it's lesliehowardyoga.com. If you can't figure out how to spell that or remember that, you can remember pelvicflooryoga.com. We'll get you to the same place. My email, if you have questions, is lesliehowardyoga@gmail.com. I have a book I have workshops. I have the intro workshops are usually about 4 hours, and there's always probably one a month in different locations. And now that we're all in lockdown, you can find me anywhere, anytime, because we're doing all the classes via Zoom right now. But yeah, that's how you find me, and I really appreciate you having me, and I appreciate you being a pelvic floor. What I call you're a pelvic floor liberator.
Most of us want to live out our life feeling healthy. And when there's just something that's keeping you down, if there's a way to get over it and be healthier and happier, I just think that's the way to go. And I'm really looking forward to starting physical therapy the first week of April. But in the meantime, I'm going to try that exercise at my kitchen sink because I'm at my kitchen sink a lot lately.
Okay, there you go. One more reason to be there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Stay well, and we'll have you back again.
All
Thanks.
right. Take
Bye
care.
bye now.
Bye.